Hi, and welcome to the second KBS Sales and Marketing podcast. With me today is Dr. Joost Rietveld. Joost is an assistant professor of strategic management at the UCL School of Management and specializes in platforms. Joost, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Stefan.
Very glad you're here today, Joost. So, Joost, why don't you tell us what you're doing and why I invited you to this podcast?
I mean, I can't really comment to the letter, but what I'm doing is, so I'm a professor in strategic management at the UCL School of Management. I specialize mostly in digital strategy and the strategy of platforms, such platforms as the iOS App Store, video game consoles, Steam, crowdfunding platforms such as Kickstarter, microfinancing platforms such as Kiva. And I'm really interested in these platforms and platform markets because they kind of behave differently than normal markets, and this has huge implications both for the firms that operate these platforms, that are responsible for commercializing these platforms, as well as for the firms or the individuals that enter these platforms. So either app developers or game developers, they clearly compete and operate in a market. But they're not facing a normal regulator. They're facing a platform company that more or less regulates their competitive dynamics, right? So if Google changes something in the Play Store, then this has huge implications for app developers. So that's what I'm really interested in, how platform dynamics affect both the companies that operate the platforms as well as the companies that operate in platforms.
Right. Thank you. I think it's really fascinating. It's such a timely topic. Obviously, we are all dependent on platforms. I mean, if you have a smartphone, you're obviously on a platform. If you want to game on a video game console, you're tied to a platform, and so on and so on. So I just wondered, like, how did you come up with that? I mean, it's such an important topic, but what really started your ambition to focus a considerable amount of time within your career on that very topic? So what fascinates you about platforms?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. It might be a bit of a lengthy answer, but I do understand we have time. So
We do.
there goes. So before I got into my PhD, I actually worked for a video game developer, a fairly small and independent video game developer that was based in the Netherlands. And this was around 2008, 2009, 2010. And so it was right around the time that the iOS App Store came on the scene. And right around the time that small companies could develop and commercialize their own products without having to rely on a large publisher, right? So before digital distribution, the firm that I worked for had to partner with an Electronic Arts or with a Ubisoft to commercialize their games, because these big companies, they controlled distribution channels. They had the capital that was required to make the physical games, to make sure that the games got into store, and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden there was digital distribution, and none of that was no longer needed. So smaller companies could bypass these large publishers, and they could directly enter these digital marketplaces, such as the iOS App Store or WeWare. That was one of the leading platforms at the time that we dealt with. And we soon realized that these markets don't operate like normal markets, and a lot of our success is very much dependent on what the platform does and the extent that the platform promotes our products or not, and all sorts of things. And to the point that when I had decided that I wanted to do a PhD, and that I was going to leave the company promised me a financial bonus. And the bonus was based on this. If I could get our latest game featured by Apple, they would give me a large financial bonus.
Wow.
Well, that never happened. I never managed. Apple's European headquarters, at least at the time, were based in London. I moved to London for my PhD, and I had good connections with Apple because we had commercialized games on the App Store before, and Apple wasn't willing or interested in featuring us. And I soon learned that kind of the rules that Apple applies to feature games and apps are very much driven by Apple's own strategic agenda. And so I quickly learned that, there is something about this platform dynamic that we don't know a lot about, that we should know a lot about, and that I want to know a lot about. And so that's kind of what motivated my PhD research.
Mhm. Yeah, wow. I think that's the most, or like the strongest foundation for a PhD I've ever heard of in terms of motivation for investigating a topic. So
Yeah,
that's
and
really,
I had good access to data from the get-go. I had good context in the industry, right? Because I worked in the industry for a while. I understood, at least to some extent, some of these dynamics. And so it was, I agree. I think it was a good foundation for a doctoral thesis.
yeah. And I mean, we still see that reflected in your research from nowadays, many years after your PhD. So I think that was a really wise choice. And what I like about your research is really that it's very close to the industry, and that the insights of your research are very close to the industry, something which we do not see all the time in
Right.
academic research, as we all know. So yeah, I'm glad you chose that topic, because I think we need more people who are closely aligned with the industry and researching that. So what I wondered, I mean, you're more in strategic management, but as you know, we are a marketing module. We're focusing on sales and marketing. So you just said like there's a lot of things which you think we should, or we didn't know at the time about platforms when you started to embark on your PhD. So taking the perspective of a marketer, and I know that you also work with marketing, why should marketers be aware of how platforms work?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think as a marketer, you need to have some sort of a basis understanding of market dynamics, right? If you don't really know what makes a product sell unless you have a basic understanding of, competition, market entry, exit, behavior of market participants, and so on and so forth. So I realize that from a marketing perspective, that might be a bit of a macro level type of topic, but I do think that it's something that should be of concern to marketeers, and it is, right? So you're right. I tend to be quite interdisciplinary in the research that I do, and I have a fair understanding of the research that is going on in the field of marketing, at least within the domain of platforms. And there's quite some interests in platforms from the marketing community. So at the very basic level, like one of the things that set platforms apart is the presence of network effects. Mm-hmm. And so the size of your market as a firm that is selling on a platform is defined, or is constrained at least, by the number of people that are on the platform, right? As a game developer, you can only sell so many copies as there are people that own the console.
Sure.
And this is one of the things that makes platforms really interesting is, okay, so if I start a new platform, there will be no games and there will be no gamers. So mm-hmm. How are you going to kickstart the platform? There is a chicken or the egg problem that these platforms face, because you need games to attract gamers and you need gamers to attract game developers. And so I think that's one of the fundamental, at least strategic challenges that a platform faces. But it's also one of the things that has great implications for firms that are selling products on platforms. Right? If you join a very new platform as a game developer, as an app developer, you will be constrained in the number of copies that you can sell. Right. But at the same time, you will face not a lot of competition, because you were one of the first developers who were daring and willing and able to enter that platform very early in its life. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're kind of in a blue ocean, and on the other hand, you're very much constrained in the number of copies that you can sell. So how do you go about that? What kind of strategies are effective at that point in time, versus what kind of strategies are effective when the platform market has turned completely red? It's a red ocean. There's so many competitors, so many app developers that you're competing with, but there's also millions of end users that you can sell your products to. So how does that work?
Yeah.
It's an interesting dynamic.
It is, and I think it's highly complex. So the next question I'm going to ask, it might be a little bit simple and you might not be able to, or at least it might be difficult to draw down to something so simple. But if you're a starting platform, what can you do to attract users?
Yeah. How do you solve the chicken and the egg problem? Right?
Exactly.
Who comes first? Is it so kind of in more general speak, a platform typically faces at least two customer groups, right?
Mhm.
So in the case of a video game platform, it's a game developer is one customer group and the gamers is the other customer group. And the platform creates value by connecting the two sides, by making sure that the two sides can find each other, so reducing search costs, and by making sure that the two sides can transact with each other, so reducing transaction costs. So that's kind of the essential, that's the kind of the platform economics 101
Yeah.
is identifying the two customer groups or more, making sure that they can connect with each other, and making sure that they can transact with each other. So what do you do then to make sure that both sides are willing to join? Well, very often one side will be more eager to have the other side on board than the other way around.
Yeah.
And the most telling example of this would be an online news platform, right? Readers of online news are not very eager to see advertisements, but advertisers really want readers, and the more the merrier, right? So a platform like The Guardian will subsidize one side of the market. Readers, you and I, we can read news for free, and they will heavily monetize the other side of the market. Advertisers pay a premium to be on that platform. So that's one way to make sure that you get users on both sides, is coming up with a price structure that entices everyone to join.
Mhm.
And that often implies subsidizing one side of the market, subsidizing one side of the platform, and overly monetizing the other side of the platform.
Okay.
We can extend this analogy to video game platforms, right? If I know you have a PlayStation 5, I have a Switch.
Yeah.
When we buy these consoles,
Yeah.
we mostly incur losses to Sony and Nintendo.
Yeah.
Sony and Nintendo are not selling these boxes to us at a hefty profit. But for every game that's being sold on the platform, regardless of who is commercializing the game, right? Whether it's Nintendo itself or some third-party publisher like Electronic Arts, the platform captures about 30% of the revenue that's being generated.
Yeah.
And so that's their business model. They subsidize us, they monetize the game developers. Why? Because game developers need a much broader base of consumers to sell to, and gamers like you and I only need maybe a handful of games to be happy and using that platform. So it makes sense to subsidize us and overprice the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the video game industry is a very interesting and fascinating example of platformization. So what you just said, I think there's another distinction which is interesting in that, and that's like digital distribution and more retail distribution, especially with video games, right? So like, we all know that Sony or Nintendo, if they distribute digitally, that they have just much more higher margins because they can cut out the middleman, right? Whereas in retail, you need that middleman. So can you see in your work or in general that can we expect a shift away from retail in contexts like that?
Yeah, so let me put it slightly differently. Because there is digital distribution,
Mm-hmm.
we see more platforms.
Yeah.
Because it's much easier to digitally connect different customer groups than it is to physically connect customer groups. Precisely because there is a physical distribution of goods. There's a bunch of middlemen that have to facilitate the stores, that have to take care of distribution of products, and so on. And so we're seeing an exponential growth in generally the number of platforms and the market share of platforms in an age of digital distribution because it's so much easier to operate a platform model in digital distribution than it is in a physical world.
Yeah.
And you're right? So the margins for a platform will be much higher on a digital sale than on a physical sale. And so I think over the last 10 years or so, these platform companies have always wanted to, at least in part, keep retailers happy because they rely on retailers also for the distribution of the platforms itself.
Yeah.
But we do see less and less of that dynamic. So I think more and more these big platform companies realize that the future is digital, and we don't really have to keep the retailers all that happy because eventually 90% of the transactions will be digital, and we no longer rely on retailers as much as we did 20 years ago.
Yeah, a lot will change on the high street, I guess, then.
Yeah, it already is, right? And it's being it's being amplified by the corona pandemic, I think.
Yes, absolutely. What I'm curious about is like how in the US, in particular, how GameStop will kind of approach that, because if I understood correctly, they try to become a platform now. Do you know more about that? I think it's really peculiar.
I don't know about the details of their platform, but I do know that they've tried setting up a digital retailing arm, if you will. But it's so counter the economics that make GameStop so profitable.
Yeah.
So a very good friend of mine, he recently published a book. It's called One Up. It's about the history of the video game industry. And he has a fantastic chapter in the book on GameStop. And what I never really realized is I think about half of the sales that occur in a GameStop store are secondhand sales, right? So gamers can buy new games in the GameStop, and they for retail price, recommended retail price, or they can buy previously owned secondhand games, typically for a much lower price, but tend to be in good condition. And a typical game can find its way back to GameStop between 5 to 7 times. So it's being purchased new, and then it comes back, then it's purchased secondhand, then it comes back, and so on and so forth. And the margin for GameStop on the secondhand sales is so much higher than it is on retail sales, on sales of new games. And so the economics of GameStop are in such large degree reliant on this repeated secondhand sales of the same game. And clearly that doesn't exist in retail. And so I understand that their resistance, their reluctance to shifting to a digital model, because they cannot sell the same game 7 times and make a tremendous margin on it. So they will reluctantly transition to digital because they realize that the physical model is about to come to an end. But I doubt that there is a place for them in the larger kind of ecosystem of game sales, right? Because it's just another intermediary, whereas we could purchase the same games directly from the platform.
Exactly. Yeah. So curious to see how that turns out, and with the people who heavily invested in the meme stock of game.
To the moon!
To the moon! Yeah, we will see how that turns out. But anyway, so I think it's a nice segue to another phenomenon we can see, and that is that we often see several platforms evolving around the same time, or that like an innovative platform is being imitated quite quickly, like Uber and Lyft and so on and so on. So how can we know what kind of platforms are actually worth working with as an organization?
Yeah. So the case of Uber and Lyft is interesting, right? So how can we know which platforms are worth working with? if we are kind of from the perspective of someone that is selling their products on the platform, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's a couple of ways to look at that. So one is, as I mentioned before, two things to look out for is how many consumers can I sell to, right? How many people have this platform, either because they bought the box or they downloaded the app. Again, you are constrained in your sales by the number of people that have the platform. And the second one is, what's the intensity of competition like on my side of the market, right? How many other apps am I competing against? How many other advertisers am I competing against? How many other drivers am I competing against? So I think that's kind of the basic analysis. Then on top of that, as we've discussed, platforms often take a revenue share or some share in your success. So how much is that share? Is it 30%? Is it 15%? And is there, what type of support is the platform offering me? For example, if you go to the App Store, you open the App Store, there's a selection of apps that is being promoted by Apple. So how likely am I to be promoted by the platform?
Yeah.
Or how strongly is the platform regulating the space that I'm operating in? If there are tight regulations that may not be favorable to me, then I might not want to be on that platform. Versus, if the rules of the platform are largely in favor of sellers, then maybe I do want to be on this platform. So that's general. But specifically, we sometimes see that platforms make specific deals with sellers, right? So maybe I am selling a product that is highly desired by a platform, and because that is the case, the platform is willing to pay me some money for exclusivity or to pay me some money for promotions. So these are things to look out for, right? And if you're just starting out as a firm, then it's not very likely that you're in a position to demand favorable treatment. But maybe if you've had a couple of successful products under your belt, then yes, particularly if you're doing something that is, for which there are not many alternatives. And kind of to make this concrete, these deals are not often disclosed, but when Electronic Arts was making Plants vs. Zombie, I think Plants vs. Zombie 2, Apple paid $50 million to have Plants vs. Zombie exclusive on the iOS App Store for a couple of weeks, because apparently Apple thought that was a game that highly rounded out their portfolio of games. So I think, that's definitely something that you want to look out for. Like, to what extent is the platform generally favoring sellers, but also specifically what is the deal that I can get with any platform. I can give another example that is a bit more personal. So we experimented a lot when I worked at the video game developer. And one thing that we did is we released the same game on different platforms. And we released our game on Steam, which is a big platform. Back then, it already was a big platform. But we also released a game on a smaller platform. I think it was called Good Old Gaming. It might not even exist anymore, that platform.
It does, though. It's pretty.
It does. Okay. And Good Old Gaming was fairly small at the time, and they didn't have many games like the ones we were offering. And Good Old Gaming made sure that the game sold well on the platform through promotions, advertising, but also because there wasn't all that much competition. And so despite the fact that Steam was so much bigger, I think we sold nearly as well on Good Old Gaming because we received favorable treatment.
Right. So it's always kind of a balance you're looking for between what's the user base on the one hand and what's like the treatment I get or the deal I can get from the platform on the other, right? And you need to weigh that trade-off.
Yeah. So size of the user base, intensity of competition from other developers or producers, and then kind of what are the platform's rules that I have to adhere to? And are there any special rules for me as a seller?
Yeah, Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's so dynamic, and I think especially the video game industry is really leading in that. Also with the Epic Game Store, which is trying to be disruptive and steal a lot of market share from Steam via exclusivity, as you said, or promotions in terms of giving away hundreds of free games for the last year or two. So yeah, there's a lot of movement and dynamic in there. But actually, I wondered what are the factors that determine whether or to what extent a platform eventually becomes successful? Is it just the user base and that there's enough offerings from sellers, or is there some kind of secret sauce in there?
Yeah, I mean, so this is an ever evolving conversation in the literature. So because of these network effects, right, that we discussed before, because of the fact that if there's more developers, then there will be more consumers and so on and so forth, there tends to be a tendency for markets to strongly revolve around one or a few platforms, right? Because it's efficient for the market. It's efficient because of these network effects. So it makes sense that the majority of a market is on one specific platform. So in the literature, this is referred to as the winner-take-all dynamic. There is a winner-take-all effect or a winner-take-most effect in most platform markets. And we see this. Google is dominating search. Apple is dominating app stores to a great extent. There's a bit of an oligopoly between Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony for consoles. And it's really, Facebook is dominating social media. And it's really difficult for new firms to break into these markets once there is a dominant platform. Because you still face the chicken and egg problem, whereas the dominant guy has everyone in the market, and no one is willing to go to the new guy.
Yeah.
So what makes you dominant? What gets you to be dominant, right? That's then, I guess, the question. And so at the very basics, it is indeed coming up with the best price structure, coming up with a business model that makes sure that entices all the customer groups to join. I think that's kind of the basic, right? You want to make sure that these network effects take effect, that they materialize. And one way that platforms do this often is when they just start out, they subsidize everyone, right? So just as what you said, like Epic, it's a great time to be a game developer because Epic is handing out bags of money to game developers because they need to kind of kickstart that network effect. And so they're willing to pay for that. So that's one strategy. Early on, endure losses, and hopefully later on you make up for it by being the dominant guy and having everyone locked in and raising your prices. The other one is you want to make sure that there is a strong lock-in mechanism. You want to make sure that once users have joined your platform, that they're also not joining some other platform. And this is where Uber and Lyft got it wrong, right? A driver and a rider on these platforms can very easily be on both platforms. And so there will always be a price war between Uber and Lyft, and us as consumers will benefit from it. So can we think of ways to lock our users in? Can we think of ways to make sure that that at least one side of the market is exclusive? It's like a relationship. You want your date to be exclusive to you, right? So and not have them date around. So the same thing with platforms. You want your users to be exclusive with you, right? Because otherwise they just date around, be on different platforms, and you can't capture the value that is being created on these platforms. So make sure you capture your audience. Make sure you lock them in, and then I think finally, right, if you have the network effect, if you have locked the users in, then also you need to find a way to capitalize on it. So have a clever way to make sure that whatever value is being created, you're also capturing a part of that, either through the pricing structure, the business model, and so what we very often see, and that's currently a debate also with regards to Apple and Google, is that once these platforms become dominant, once they are the main player in the market, they switch their antics. They start to exploit, they start to milk the cow much more than they did before, because
Yeah.
that's the time when users are locked in, you are dominant, the new guy can't break in the market. So that's when you have to start, reaping what you sowed. It's starting to kind of to benefit from the investments you made earlier on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it will work out with Uber, because I mean, obviously they're still subsidizing heavily. But as you said, is there an end in sight for them heavily subsidizing? And probably not. So yeah, really curious to see whether Uber is a actually worthwhile investment in the future in terms of that. So yeah, so that's really interesting to hear how they become successful. But if we take a switch more to the seller side, from your experience, what's the most occurring mistake sellers are actually making when it comes to dealing with platforms?
Well, at large, it is operating under the notion that it's a regular market and not a platform market.
Mm-hmm.
So not taking into account the size of the user base, not taking into account where a platform is in its life cycle, not kind of adjusting what you're offering to match with kind of the type of user that is on the platform. So I'll give you another example that that I dealt with when I was more or less wrapping up my PhD. So at the time, this is around 2014, I think. The game Watch Dogs was released by Ubisoft.
Mm-hmm.
And Watch Dogs is an action adventure game, but it was a very innovative action adventure game. It was a new intellectual property, right? It was not based on a movie. It was not a sequel to a previously successful video game. So it was an innovative game. And that game was being sold, I think, on at least 4 different platforms. So it was sold on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, which were at that time coming towards the end of their life. It was sold on the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, which at that time were just starting out. Right, so there was an overlap in the life cycle of these platforms, and there were 170 million, so 170 users on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and there were 17 million users, so 17, on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. So 10 times as many users on the older platform. And despite the fact that the market was so much larger on the older platform, the game sold twice as many copies on the new platform. It sold 4.2 million copies, I think, on the new platforms, and it sold about 2 million copies on the old platform. And this baffled everyone in the industry. Like, why is it that a game that faces a market that is 10 times bigger sells half the copies on a market that is 10 times smaller? And the game is the same, right? It's exactly the same game. And so the reason for this is, there were many early adopters. There were many hardcore gamers that were first to try out these new platforms, right? People that were enthusiastic about video games are the first to try out and to buy a new platform. They are willing to spend more money on it. They are willing to buy it without knowing whether it will become successful. And that's exactly the audience that is also willing to buy an innovative video game, that to take a risk on a property that's not proven itself before. And so there was a natural fit between the users on these the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One and the type of game that Watch Dogs was, that wasn't there on the older platform. And so the lesson is this: you want to adjust the type of content or the type of product that you're making to the type of users that are on the platform.
Right. That makes sense. I think it's a beautiful illustration. And I think we can see that in this console life cycle now again. with early adopters with the new machines, which are very hard to get, right? I mean, if you were really early, you could get them, but right now you can't really get them. But I think we might see the same with the recent Watch Dogs, right? The Watch Dogs Legion, which is just, which is also superior on the new machines, right?
Mm.
So these early adopters might be more likely to get that also just because it's like one of a few games which actually work as eye candy to demonstrate the power of the new machines, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And Ubisoft, so the publisher behind Watch Dogs, and I don't know if Watch Dogs is the example that kind of gave them this realization, or that they already had this realization. But Ubisoft is one of the few publishers who consistently supports every new platform there is in the market
Mm-hmm.
with generally with innovative new titles. So, for example, they had Zombie U on the Wii U,
Yeah.
right? They had Watch Dogs on the PlayStation 4, and so they understand this strategy. They understand the strategy to seed new platforms with innovative games,
Yeah.
and it's very clever because if one of these games becomes successful, you then have 7 years to make sequels and really exploit that property. So it's a really clever strategy that I don't think all of the publishers have picked up on yet.
Yeah, I agree. And on top of that, they also have their own platform, obviously, with Uplay on the PC, which
Yeah.
pays them well, as far as I know. So yeah, it's an interesting company to look at in that context. And building up on that, if you could give sellers just a single piece of advice on how to work with platforms, what would that be? Like, your bulletproof advice, which you would like to send around the world.
Right. Well, so yeah, so generally it's understand the market as a platform and not as a regular market, right? With everything that we've just discussed. So that it's broad advice, and so it's not very specific. But I will illustrate it with a specific example. So I told you that I was promised a financial bonus if I managed to get our game featured by Apple.
Yes.
And in subsequent years, I've done research on this. We have learned that Apple has a promotional strategy that very much links with their own strategic agenda. And what I mean by that is, if Apple introduces a new feature in the iOS App Store, let's say in-app purchases, which they did a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
then whatever is being promoted on the Apple platform tends to make use of the new features. So they use their promotions to showcase the iOS operating system's new feature. And so you, as a seller, you want to understand the platform. You want to know that, okay, maybe there's a new iOS operating system update that is imminent, and they're going to heavily push in-app purchases in this update. Then I want to have in-app purchases in my app, because that will give me some currency with Apple that might lead me to be promoted, that lead me to be either promoted on the platform or being part of some showcase Apple presentation whatsoever. And so this is not a guarantee for success, but it's going to increase your chances for success.
Right.
And these promotions are free, right? If Apple does promote you, doesn't cost you a thing, and research has shown that it can boost your sales by 600-700% for at least 2-3 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great opportunity. I think, yeah, you said it's a very broad lesson, but I think it's a very valuable one to understand your market, which you're operating in anyways. In marketing, I think we put emphasis on that, but that's a really, really important thing to consider. So this was really interesting, but I have like one burning question on my mind, which we're all waiting for, and that is obviously, what's your favorite platform, Joost?
What is my favorite platform? Well, as a consumer, it's the Nintendo Switch. I love playing. I love Nintendo games. I think they're awesome. As a producer, it's Instagram. As you know, I have two very cute twin British short hair cats
I know,
that
they're
have
lovely.
that have about 85,000 followers at the time.
Yeah.
And we're trying to we're trying to spark some joy into people's everyday lives by posting cute cat pictures, but we're also using it to do a bit of marketing, to try some
Hmm.
strategies, right? So the cats have worked with the cats have promoted Spotify's Pets playlist.
Yeah.
They have promoted the Secret Life of Pets movies,
Yeah.
and so in a way, with the cats, we are almost like a seller on the Instagram platform, right? So I try to practice what I preach, if you will. So.
That's a great example. I will make sure to put the link to your cats, which indeed are a joy to look at. So they brighten up your day if you follow them. I will make sure to put that on Keats for everybody to have a look if you're interested in that.
Yeah, if there's anything you take away from all my rambling, it's follow my cats on Instagram.
Follow the cats on Instagram. I think that's a lovely line to close this podcast. Joost, this was really, really interesting. I think it was a lovely and really important addition to this week's content in the sales and marketing module. And I would like to thank you very much for taking the time for being with us today. And
yeah. Thank you for having me, and I hope that your listeners will enjoy this.
I'm sure they will. At least, if we're not enjoying our conversation, I'm sure they will enjoy the cat pictures. So there will be some kind of enjoyment anyways.
Awesome.
Great. Okay, Joost, thank you so much. And to you guys, the students, listeners, I'll catch you guys in the next lecture. And there will be more podcasts to follow. I have more interesting guests in our little show who are willing to talk with me about very interesting and relevant topics. So stay tuned for that. And that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.